Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Tanner. I'm the vice chair of the Group of 78 and the chair of the conference organizing committee this year. And I'll just open with a couple of acknowledgements. We acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation territory. And we acknowledge that we are living in a climate emergency with a fast closing window for humanity to take effective action to address the existential threat to our survival. Without addressing this crisis, other endeavors will become mute and moot. And this is the third day of our 2020 Group of 78 annual conference. 2021, Group of 78 annual conference, this year on adaptation to climate change, building resilience to meet the global climate catastrophe. And it is a follow-up on our 2018 conference, Meeting the Climate Challenge, Accelerating the Transition to a Post-Carbon World. And so you might assume from the fact that we're having this follow-up that we're not real keen on the acceleration not having happened. The aim of this conference is to enhance the national and global dialogue on adaptation to climate change in recognition of the fact that despite the existence of climate catastrophes around the world, adaptation tends to be neglected in Canada and elsewhere. Last Thursday, we opened with an excellent keynote by Professor Adjei on reforms to the global economic system, which are desperately needed to allow less developed countries to adapt. Friday, we discussed the necessity of large infrastructure investments necessary everywhere to protect communities now and in the future. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to the moderator of our food adaptation panel, Bruce Currie-Alder of IDRC, the International Development Research Center. As program leader, Climate Resilience, Bruce invests in evidence that contributes to adaptation across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. IDRC partners with the UK government to enable poor and marginalized communities in the Global South to be more resilient to climate change, and with the government of the Netherlands to support the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. Bruce's expertise spans environmental science and international development, and he holds a PhD in public policy. So over to you, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for those warm remarks. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a very busy time in the calendar year, and it's always busy at the start of a work week as well. What I understand about our panel today is that we're really asking ourselves, how will food systems adapt? How do they need to adapt to a changing climate? How can we redesign the current food systems in Canada and globally to ensure equitable production and distribution of healthy food while preserving and restoring ecosystems? What I'd like to do just to set the scene is bring out sort of four salient observations from the literature that keeps me awake at night. First, food systems are responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions when we take processing and transport into account, in addition to the production of food, what's happening on the farm, if you will. Secondly, global agricultural productivity, by some estimates, has been reduced by about 1/5 since 1961 by climate change we've already experienced. And we know that more is happening now and is on its way. Third is it's not just the quantity of food, but also the quality of food that changes with climate change. There is evidence that increased levels of carbon dioxide are causing certain species of rice or strains of rice to change, to actually become less nutritious. So what will be the quality of our food under a changing climate is something that we're actively understanding. Fourth is the finding from the Eat Lancet Commission that found that unhealthy diets pose a greater risk to morbidity and mortality than does unsafe sex, alcohol, drugs, and tobacco use combined. So with all of that, it's really timely that we have this panel today. We have the UN Food Summit from last week. We're just a couple of months away from the next part of the IPCC report on climate change. That includes a chapter on food and fiber and is really the report that will talk about how can we adapt. We've already seen last August the report of what's actually happening in terms of the physical sciences. So without further ado, I will introduce the flow of the panel and our first panelists. I'll actually introduce each speaker just before they come in. But in general, the flow of the panel will go from the global context to the Canadian, and then to a more local perspective, particularly a voice from, or a set of voices from the Global South. And our intention isn't to give you the masterclass, but really a sampler plate, if you will. Each of these points we can bring out greater in depth. And indeed, we look to you to stimulate our own Q&A session in a bit. There is the option at the bottom of your screen to activate the question and answer. If you have a question at any time before we get to the end, feel free to put it in ahead of time. And if you see a question that already resonates with your own curiosity, feel free to upvote that. And that will make it more clear to us which ones are in multiple people's minds as we head into it. So without further ado, I'll just say Sophia Murphy is the Executive Director at the Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy. Sophia is a food systems and international economy expert with 30 years of professional experience, a policy expert and advocate who has focused on resilient food systems. Sophia has worked across civil society and government, including roles within the United Nations and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, based here in Canada. She has served on the steering committee of the UN high-level panel of experts on food security. So perhaps, Sophia, you can give us the global context as we're thinking about food and climate adaptation.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you to the G78 for this opportunity to speak with you today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Ojibwe and Dakota peoples, traditional and ancestral lands, today known as Minneapolis. Recently moved here after 11 years in Squamish in British Columbia. And I'm very glad to be able to talk to you. I will say a few things that maybe will be less about adaptation, but I hope will open up the conversation to come. I want to focus a little bit on some of the general risks that climate change is posing to agriculture and the distribution of those risks, which it'll be no surprise is not, they're not equally distributed, and referring to the most recent IPCC report that came out in August. And then to focus on food security more specifically, and our understanding of the concept, how that's evolved, because I think it's important to reflect on what food security means and what is going to have to change when we adapt. What are we adapting to, and where do we think we're headed when we consider adaptation and its contents? And then finally, to emphasize Canada's role in this, which I think has at least 6 components. That's what I'm going to suggest. So from the August IPCC, and of course, probably from all of you just reading a newspaper, we know that climate change is already happening and it's inevitable. And the focus of the summer reports, at least from the IPCC, was really on how still we can make such an important difference by containing the global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than allowing it to go to 2 Celsius or more. And right now we're on track for more. So I think one of the main messages was that we still have a lot we need to do, even though we've let decades of time go by without taking the actions needed. And that the difference between holding at 1.5 or allowing it to 2 degrees Celsius or beyond are really huge, especially in terms of the kind of north-south interests that we have in mind, which is just generally for our children and for their children beyond. The report confirmed that some of the most fragile places are already some of the poorest, and that they're not just in tropical latitudes, but also places like Canada's north, where many of our Indigenous peoples live, and lands, of course, Indigenous peoples across the whole Arctic Circle, and those peoples of boreal forests as well. The report also emphasizes the effect on fisheries, and here I can just put up a short slide that's a quote really from the IPCC report about what they think the effect would be in terms of numbers and the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees for the world. But notice they also emphasize that those populations, especially at risk, are the local communities who depend on agriculture and on fisheries. The oceans have already absorbed a great deal of the climate change that has happened over the past decades. So I think the other thing that's important, and I don't know that it comes out of the IPCC report only, but also out of the Joint Biodiversity Convention and Climate Change Convention secretariats, that we have huge biodiversity losses associated with expected climate change, already occurring climate change. And the food security is going to be affected by that biodiversity loss, of course, at least as much. And so I think that that's going to be an important direction when we think about adaptation and where we should invest our money and how we should think about the problem of adaptation. From our point of view, biodiversity is a very promising way to think about the problem because it forces attention to landscapes and to local contexts. It kind of eliminates the temptation we have to look for magic bullets and solutions that would fit everybody in all places. And it should remind global decision makers, even national decision makers, that if they don't see what's happening locally, they're going to be missing an important part of both the challenge and also of the opportunities that they have. The second thing, in addition to the link to biodiversity, the importance. It's important to understand risk. There was a recent report from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I can put a link into the notes for the meeting, looking at where risk is increased, and that risk is not just in the weather changes, the droughts we've seen, the increased incidence of forest fires, the increased incidence of floods affecting production, but it's also, of course, affecting distribution and all of our assumptions about where food will go and how it will get there, where it will be stored, how it will be stored. All of these things are also affected. And so as a trading power, Canada has to think about that holistically and not just focus on yields of plants in specific places in order to understand the effects. I think there's three more things I would say about IPCC before turning to food security. So one is to understand that the affected communities are usually within a country. We can generalize, and we often do that, especially in development circles, talking about countries. Trade circles like to do that too. But actually, it's not the whole country, usually it's within that. So understanding the power of different affected communities is really important to have. It's really important to have that understanding in order to intervene effectively. It's rarely going to be at the national level that the whole country is affected together. And similarly, it's rarely going to be a country on its own that can make all the difference. So these national adaptation policies are vital, but totally insufficient to deal with a global problem like climate change. So it is really incumbent on a country like Canada, seeking to do its best as a kind of global citizen, that Canada think about its role as a multifaceted interlocutor and not simply as a provider perhaps of technology or of financial assistance. And I'll come back to that at the end. So if we move to thinking about food security, I have a slide that maybe for me is helpful. I'm just going to walk through and try not to take very long as I do it. But I think it's really important to understand that what we mean by food security has changed. And sometimes people get stuck in an older idea. So if you start in the top left corner of this picture, the first time you hear the UN talk about food security is in 1974. And that was in the wake of an abrupt period of very high prices in international markets, coinciding with crop failures, coinciding with a breakdown really in the distribution system, that where food went and how it moved broke down. And that first decade really focused very much on a definition of food security that was all about supply. How many acres or how many tons of corn do we need for so many head of population, counted at a national level. In the 1980s, and I think Amartya Sen is the kind of crucial thinker here, at least in my mind, we began to understand something about the relationships that make food security real. That it's not just whether the food is available in the supply, but how people access that food. Climate change is affecting people's access to food as well by changing economic outcomes. And Amartya Sen detailed a number of relationships that matter and emphasized not only the role of the market, which was critical, but also the role of the state and also the role of households, of culture, of the non-private, but also non-governmental relationships that protect food security. And that began to emerge and evolve in conjunction with our understanding of nutrition, and an understanding that just calories alone didn't make for healthy, well people. And the nutrition conferences and goals start to come through in the 1990s. And by 1996, we get this definition of food security that we mostly use today, where we're looking for both physical and economic access to a sufficient, safe, and nutritious diet for all. And we have those pillars, as they came to be called, the supply, but also access, the utilization, which touches on nutrition and the conditions in which people get food, all resting on stability. And so now into this 2020 period, that stability thing has come to merge with our understanding of systems, and to see food security as interrelated with a whole series of systems. Those are biological, they're also economic, like trade systems, investment systems, and then, of course, climate change and weather systems, the sort of basis of our planet. And that's where we get these words like sustainability, resilience, and we start to think about shocks in a different way and understand that you can have multiple kinds of shocks that amplify each other. And you can also have systems to prevent that, insurance, if you like, that will help to muffle shocks and protect us from the consequences of, say, a failed harvest or a trade spat, such as those we saw between Canada and China, or the United States and China recently. The last thing I'll say on this slide, and it's last but very much not least, is alongside an understanding of how food security is wrapped into economic, cultural, and ecological systems, is this question of agency and politics. And the UN Committee on World Food Security and its high-level panel of experts have formally introduced this agency as part of our food security understanding. And I think that that's really a very important part of this whole discussion that we have on how adaptation will succeed, is to understand that people need a political voice, and also that we're going to need to be accountable in ways beyond the national border. And I think the multilateral system is still struggling with that. But we need to think about the way the UN hears from non-governmental voices, the way that for the most part our economic and financial systems do not hear from non-governmental voices, and that remains a lack. And then also within countries, how important it is for us to protect access to natural resources for local communities. So I think I'm just lost my place a little, but I think what I should do is, I'll say one or two more things. Bruce, I'll look to you for a signal. I have these last 6 things I want to say about Canada, but maybe before I get that is to say something about mitigation, which I think remains a critically important part of food security and adaptation. We need to stop the harm at the same time as we chart out a course and invest in what we need to change as the climate changes around us. So both in anticipating what will come, but also in turning off the hose, as it were. And there's so much we can do within agriculture. Agriculture is a major contributor to climate change, as Bruce said. Mostly it's our industrialized country agriculture that is the problem, although there are also issues in the global south. And we can do a lot, not very much money, to stop that harm. So just wanting to really emphasize that and to point to one of the initiatives that has gained a lot of popularity around carbon markets and soil carbon sequestration, and to say that while it's useful to think about how to sequester soil and carbon in the soil, thinking about the world somehow as a great big kind of shock absorber for the undue greenhouse gas emissions from industrialized economies is really no kind of answer, partly because the land is already pretty saturated, also because the land has many other uses that we need it to put it to, and finally because it would ignore all of the biodiversity that we also need to protect, which is why I think coming back and thinking about biodiversity gives us a more productive lens on what adaptation should look like. And so maybe coming to that point, because Canada could do a lot to mitigate climate change within agriculture, especially its methane production and nitrous oxide production, but also coming to the larger role I see for Canada, I would say these few things. One, that as a donor, the focus that our international development assistance has had on women's empowerment, as well as on global food security over the last 10 to 15 years, and more recently on climate change, are all important. Understanding those connections matters. It's been hard to put into practice, and I speak as a former and active member of Canada's, food security policy group. Nonetheless, it's very encouraging that Canada set policy objectives in all of those three areas as connected. Secondly, though, Canada is a major food exporter, and we supply a lot of food to international markets. And so thinking about that, as trade negotiators, we push hard to get the market access, to create dependency in some sense. And our role as a food provider is not a bad one per se, but we do have a responsibility to think ahead to what our future prognosis for production is, what the current production is doing to the climate, and whether that's affecting other countries' independent ability to produce the food that they need, including from the oceans. And then to kind of count that climate cost so that we understand that the providing food to international markets is both a commercial interest and an ethical one, and we can't ignore one at the expense of the other. Third, as a food importer, we're dependent on a number of ecological zones elsewhere that are at risk from climate change. California is a big and obvious example, but Canada imports 40% of the food that we consume. And we need to think about both what we eat and whether that's appropriate, and also what the future looks like, how we might adapt our diets in order to reduce our impact on the planet. Fourth, as a large contributor to greenhouse gases in the wider economy, we're affecting other countries' ability to grow their food. And so that continuing fight we have to come to the right transition policies is very urgent, and not just for Canadians. And finally, as a diplomatic actor, Canada is a wealthy country, understands multilateralism better, I think, than many other wealthy countries, because we're relatively less powerful in the global negotiations that go on. And we don't always make best use of that. I would urge Canada to take a strong place in defending multilateral interests and the interests of poorer countries than ours. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophia. And right on to the second, in terms of 15 minutes, you've set the bar for everyone else for timekeeping. Thank you for that. Eloquent tour de force. And again, the idea that this is a sampler plate, not a full meal, but you were able to give a 50-year history of thinking on food security, and then bring it into some of the climate issues and ways of thinking of that are absolutely critical at this moment. And you've already, in some ways, brought the global context back home to Canada, which is perfect platform for Darrin to come in. Darrin Qualman is director of the Climate Crisis Policy and Action for National Farmers Union. Beyond 2 decades of working the land and a family farm, his expertise spans history, biology, political studies. He served on the board of directors of the ETC group, addressing how new technologies impact the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. And Darrin describes himself as a civilizational critic and avid observer of the big picture, which he has invested into the writing of the 2019 book, Civilization Critical, Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future with Fernwood Publishing. Darrin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thank you, Sophia, for that excellent presentation, and thank you, Susan, for convening the session. I'll just share my screen here. Bruce, can you see cattle and wind turbines?
Looking good.
Very good. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the G78 for giving us the opportunity to present some views here from the National Farmers Union. As Bruce said, I'm Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the NFU. So my presentation today is going to look at the farm and food system in Canada, the emissions from that system, the ways that we can reduce those emissions, the policies we need to transition to a climate compatible agriculture, and the capacities or limits to capacities to adapt agriculture in the face of what's currently looking like very rapid, very significant, and very damaging levels of climate change. Just a note about where I am. That's the farm I grew up on and that I live on in Saskatchewan. It doesn't look that way today. This was taken in the winter, of course. Unfortunately, it's going to look that way in a month or two. But that barn was built in 1918 to house draft horses to farm the farm, and those solar panels were put up 100 years later in 2018. So we spend some time thinking about how farms are powered and energized, and the various transitions we went through. For instance, that barn is kind of symbolic of 9,900 years of solar-powered agriculture. We've had a period of fossil-fueled agriculture, and those solar panels may be a hint that a return or a move away from fossil-fueled agriculture might be in our future. So I'm going to talk first about the levels of climate change we're seeing. Some of you might know about an annual report from the UN, the Emissions Gap Report. It came out, the most recent one in 2020. There's going to be another one in a month or two. But what the Emissions Gap Report showed in 2020 and in previous years, it hasn't changed much, is that we are not on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius in global temperature increase, and we're not even on track for 2 degrees. We are on track for 3.2 degrees right now. What the UN and climate scientists around the world did is they took all the commitments to reduce emissions, et cetera, that were made in Paris and elsewhere, all the policies that were in place, all the EV incentives, et cetera. They put those into a set of modeling computers and asked the computer if everyone did what they said they were going to do, by how much would the Earth warm? And the answer they came back with is not 1.5 or 2 degrees, but 3.2 degrees Celsius. So that's the track we're on now. We have to get off it, but that's the track we're on now. So that's very bad news, of course, that we're on track for 3.2, but it's even worse news for Canada and our agricultural systems, because non-coastal areas, continental interiors, and northerly latitudes have been warming and are projected to continue warming at about twice the rate of the global average. Therefore, Canada's prairie region, where 85% of our food-producing land is located, Canada's prairie region and some adjacent regions, such as parts of Ontario and Quebec, are on track for 6.4 degrees of warming this century. BC and the Maritimes just 3.2, which is damaging enough, but the continental interior is on track for about 6.4 degrees of warming this century. So it's clear that we're not doing enough. We're not doing it fast enough. We have to make and meet much more ambitious emission reduction targets. Our current targets, even though they've been upped, remain weak. Our levels of actions are slow, and we have to do more. So a key question is, can farmers and food systems adapt? And it's a good news, bad news situation. Farms and food systems really can adapt. I've spent my whole life on this farm. We farmed for many years. I don't farm anymore, but I've been an observer of this place and this agriculture for a long time. And I've seen profound changes. Almost nothing that was being done in the 80s in terms of cropping systems is being done now. There's been profound changes. So a lot of adaptation is underway. But the problem is we can't adapt to 6.4 degrees coming in 1 century. It's almost a degree per decade. So in the face of that kind of incredibly rapid and damaging climate change, farmers' capacities to adapt are relatively modest. And as Sophia said, it's hard to generalize. Different parts of the country are going to be impacted in different ways, and adaptation will proceed in a very place-based context. But we do know that if we stay on the track for 6.4 degrees, the impacts in some places will be so damaging that agriculture will be profoundly changed, and in some places it may have to be abandoned altogether. So, in addition to being highly vulnerable to climate change, agriculture, and Sophia mentioned it and Bruce mentioned it, agriculture is also a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to give you a bit of a primer of what kinds of greenhouse gases come out of agriculture. So this is a graph that we've put together at the National Farmers Union. It's probably the most detailed graph available of all of the different kinds of emissions that come out of agriculture in Canada. A couple of things. One, you'll notice the top line, agricultural emissions are going up, yet we have committed to reduce emissions nationally by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So the first thing I'd bring your attention to is that agricultural emissions are going in the wrong direction. That top line is up by about 30%. Second, although the graph looks very complex, there's really three main types of emissions here. All of those blue bands at the bottom are livestock and manure, and that's mostly cattle. The big blue band there is enteric emissions from cattle. It's a complex question, cattle emissions, but as currently measured, what goes onto the Canadian balance sheet, there's a lot there from methane from cattle. Those green bands in the middle are largely nitrogen fertilizer related, and you can see that's the part that really expands. That's the part that really drives the upward trend on that top line. The reason that Canadian agricultural emissions are going up is because farmers are using more and more fossil fuel derived nitrogen fertilizer. And then the red bands near the top are fuel use. So that's diesel fuel in machinery, gasoline in light trucks, heating fuel for barns and farm buildings, etc. So that's kind of an overview of where the emissions come from. Those cattle emissions are mostly methane. The nitrogen-related emissions are mostly nitrous oxide with some CO2, and the fuel is mostly carbon dioxide. But when we think of emissions, we usually think of fuel, we usually think of carbon dioxide, but in agriculture, it's livestock and fertilizer that are also large contributors. I mentioned that the big driver in the increase in emissions from agriculture is nitrogen. This is a graph of nitrogen fertilizer use in Canada since the 1940s. And you can see that nitrogen use has quadrupled since the 70s and doubled since the 90s. A lot of the increasing output, the increasing yield and production in Canada and around the world is really a function of increasing inputs into the system. And I want to talk specifically about that for a minute, because I want to give you a foundational insight into agriculture and food and the emissions that come out of it, so that you can really think through what a food system, a low emission food system would look like. So step back and look at the big picture for a moment. Agriculture is about 10,000 years old. Humans have practiced agriculture for about 100 centuries. For 99% of that time, it was solar powered, low input, and zero net emission. For 9,900 years, farmers farmed, and they did not affect the climate or the atmosphere. But for just 100 years, for just 1% of the time that we've practiced agriculture, it has been input dependent, high input, fossil fuel dependent, and high emission. And the key insight here is something quite striking, and that is that agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. The emissions coming out one end are largely a function of the petro-industrial inputs being pushed in the other. And what that tells us is any low emission food production system will be a low input food production system. And people that talk about emission reduction without talking about backing some of those inputs out the other end aren't really serious about moving toward transformative change in real low emission systems. To adapt and to reduce emissions, we need policy supports. Farmers want to help meet our 2030 and 2050 targets, but we need federal, provincial, territorial, we need support at all levels to partner with farmers to make the transitions we need. Some of the policies we could look at, key to both emission reduction and resilience and adaptation, is healthy soils. Soils that are high in carbon and high in organic matter are spongy. They soak up water. When water falls on them or tries to run across them, they soak that up, they capture it, they hold it. And that water's there when it's needed, when a drought comes perhaps. The soil has more water holding capacity. That's really key to both preventing flooding, the water running off, and to dealing with droughts. You saw previously that nitrogen fertilizer is a real contributor to emissions. We need to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use and pursue low input agriculture overall. In terms of cattle, we need to maximize the benefits in terms of healthy grassland ecosystems at the same time that we minimize the emissions from those systems. In terms of fuel use, we need to electrify farm equipment. We need to electrify farm building heating, as in the rest of the economy. We need to electrify just about everything we can electrify, because electricity can be produced with low emission systems. And finally, I'd say we need to reinvest in institutions in Canada and around the world. Some of you might have heard of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, the PFRA. It came out of the 1930s and the real climate impact of the Dust Bowl and the 1930s drought. Unfortunately, Canada very unwisely destroyed the PFRA in recent decades. We need to bring back a 21st century version of the PFRA in a way that can deal with the climate challenges that we're now facing, and that can oversee the transformations we need in agriculture to move farmers and food production systems to the low emission, resilient, climate compatible models we need moving forward. I just want to flag a few false solutions, and Sophia touched on this a little bit. There's a lot of solutions trotted out that are either not a good idea or that are often oversold. Biofuels is one. Happy to take questions on that. Ethanol and biodiesel are often touted as climate solutions, and there's tremendous limits and some problems. Emissions trading systems, otherwise known as offsets or carbon credits or market mechanisms, some real problems there. In general, we just shouldn't see the emission of a fossil fuel carbon atom as somehow offset or negated by its resequestration in soil. Those two are not really comparable. There's a lot of over-optimistic assessments of soil carbon sequestration. Farmers can capture carbon, they can put it in the soil, and that's a really vital soil health measure, but it is not a climate solution, and it is not a way of mopping up the trillions of tons of carbon that have come out of the petro-industrial system. Nature-based solutions can also be very limited. They're often oversold. Tree planting is one. The land area is limited, and as Sophia said, there's other things we're asking of the land. And then the final one I'd mention under false solutions is just this sense of techno-salvation, that somehow artificial intelligence or robots or autonomous tractors or big data platforms, precision agriculture, that somehow high-tech solutions will somehow change agriculture profoundly, and it'll go from increasing emissions to decreasing. Technology is important, and farmers are embracing technology, but we need to keep that into context. So what do we need to do? There's a lot of positives here, a lot of good news. Farmers can, in partnership with government, cut emissions very dramatically, maybe by more than 20% by 2030. But we need to rethink this. We need to have a new set of goals. We need to reconsider our prime directives around export maximization, production maximization, et cetera, because things like export maximization and production maximization often mean input maximization, which means maximum emissions. And again, I'll repeat what I said before, any low emission farm and food system will be a low input system. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'll just flag two things in wrap up. At the NFU website, and I'll put the link in the chat, are two reports, one tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis, a 100-page deep dive into the issues I've talked about today, and the other one, the Imagine If report, a vision of a near zero farm and food system for Canada, a tremendously optimistic and forward-looking report about how getting things right might look in 2030. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to Bruce for chairing.
Thanks, Darrin. Tour de force, again, a great sampler of what we could spend a lot of time addressing, but we don't have a lot of time. Some of the things I really liked in your presentation was that sense of almost fear. You know, there is a scale of climate impact which one cannot adapt to, or at least cannot adapt to without fundamentally thinking of transformation. Yet a tremendous willingness that I think you've expressed of being able to adapt to that which can be done, and being able to embrace the transition that's needed, yet recognizing that support is needed to do that, which I think is a perfect segue for our colleagues who will be speaking from another local context. So Sandra and Nee in just 1 second. But before I turn over to them, I just want to remind everyone online, we will be transitioning into a Q&A or a discussion after a while. So feel free again to hit the button on the Q&A, question and answer below, and put forward your own points. We have one from Irvin already. We'll hopefully get a few more and collect and bring those into the discussion a bit later. And again, if you see something you liked and it resonates with what your curiosity is, feel free to upvote that question so it's more visible to us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Sandra, Obiri Yeboah, and Nee Adjei Sowah, both of which are affiliated with the University of Ghana and Queen Elizabeth Scholars here with Carleton University in Canada. Sandra is a PhD candidate at the Center for Migration Studies and contributes to the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy. Her research examines the impact of climate change on the psychological well-being of people from vulnerable rural communities and their intention to migrate. And Sandra and me, I understand, are doing sort of a tag team, so they'll go straight at it. I'll introduce me while I'm at it, who is a PhD candidate with the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, or ISSER. His research explores the influence of inheritance and land tenure arrangements on adaptation to climate variability impacts. He's keenly interested in understanding how social systems arrangements influence gender relations and access to and control over resources. So Sandra and Nee, over to you. And I will again give you the sort of reminders by chat as we get close to time.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce, for the kind introduction. Let me begin by sharing my slides. Please, can we all see my slides?
Looks good.
Thank you. And I am presenting together with Nee, and our topic is on adaptation strategies to climate change impact on food security and livelihood among communities in Ghana. And by way of outline, we begin with introduction through to suggested strategies and policy actions. And drawing from what has been said by my other speakers, it is clear that climate change has become a major environmental and developmental concern for countries globally. And this has shown in record changes in terms of temperature, precipitation, and rainfall. And there has been a rise in global temperature from mid-20th century. And even though Africa is the least emitters of greenhouse gas concentration into the atmosphere, the region is expected to bear the brunt of climate change and its related impacts, and is more likely to also experience greater warming than the rest of the world. And this is evident in terms of flooding and drought. And some parts of Africa would also get warmer than other parts, whilst other parts also get drier compared to other geographic regions. And from the map, it indicates that it indicates major climate regions in Africa. And as we can see from the map, northern parts of Africa and some parts of the South Africa is also dominated by desert conditions. And this is clearly evidence of climate change and its related impacts, where we have the central portion of the continent wetter, as I have already said, with tropical rainforest, grasslands, and also semi-arid climates. And by way of projection, this is projected temperature changes in Africa. And between 2020 to 2049, the mean temperature of Africa is expected to rise to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And also between 2040 to 2069, the average temperature is also expected to rise to 3.5 degrees Celsius. And also between 2070 to 2099, the average temperature is also expected to rise to 6.5.
Wrongly.
It's also
you don't put pressure on yourself.
It's also expected to rise to 6.5 degrees Celsius. And this is clearly evidence of climate change and its related impact. And this shows that Africa is likely to experience warmer temperature in the coming years. And here is evidence of climate change. In Ghana, temperature has risen to about nearly 1 degree Celsius between 1960s and that of 2000. And this is also not different from what is experienced in the northern parts of Ghana, where we have temperature rising to a maximum of 0.5 degrees Celsius, to a minimum of 0.5 degrees Celsius and a maximum of 1.0 degrees Celsius. And here, according to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index for 2015, 7 of the 10 countries most at risk of climate change are in Africa. And this has also been shown in decrease in temperature over the years, where Southern Africa and also the Sahel is expected to experience decrease in rainfall and also increase in rainfall in some parts of the Central Africa. And in terms of weather-related disasters such as floods and droughts, in the past 25 years, Africa has doubled in terms of flooding and drought. And Africa has a higher mortality rate from droughts than any other region in the world. And when it comes to people affected by droughts, yes, 45 million people across 14 countries in 2019 is affected by droughts. An implication on food production and supply. Here, droughts, flooding have all led to reduction in crop yields and also livestock. And this is evident in East Africa, where they experience the worst food crisis in the 21st century. And majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa also face the threat of availability and access to food in terms of unreliable production systems, since the majority of the population in the rural communities are heavily reliant on rain-fed agriculture for livelihood and subsistence. Therefore, any minute changes in the weather elements affects their livelihoods and also subsistence. So this greatly impacts on the food security in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have the safety and nutritional value, which is affected during extreme weather events. And also in terms of distribution and exchange, it's also affected. And this from the graph, it is clear that even in the 2010 and 2014, what was produced in Africa was lower than what was produced in the 1960s in America. And this shows a wide gap in terms of food production levels, becoming difficult for Africa to depend on her own food production. And juxtaposing the already vulnerable food production capacity is climate change. And this climate change effect is on food production is projected by International Food Policy Research Institution, and which is based on assumed changes in population and income as reflected in the shared socioeconomic pathways in the IPCC, and also the climate change impacts are also stimulated using the IPCC representative concentration pathways. And this projection was based on using the 2010 as baseline or index. And here from the projection, we can clearly see that 2010, from 2010, we can see that 2030, we can see that food production will increase by 0.37 in 2030 and further increase by 0.69 in 2050. However, climate change impact will...
Okay, may I continue?
Please do, Nee.
Okay, this projections are just showing how the situation is for Africa as a collective unit. However, the situation is worse in central and then in eastern parts of Africa, where the differences between projected differences between production from 2030 to 2050 tends to be lower as the years move on. And the same applies to the number of people who are at greater risk of hunger. So having this broader context of the situation in Africa, we want to zoom directly into the situation as we have it specifically in Ghana. And food production indeed is threatened in a lot of ways. Over the past, I think in Ghana, over the past 10 years, we've really seen the signs that climate change is having a big effect on food production, especially with the increase in the frequency of extreme weather events. So you have a lot of long dry spells and then also increasing precipitation. As I speak to you, it's raining heavily in Ghana, leading to so much flood across the country, from the capital to the Upper East region and then in the northern regions. And the northern region tends to suffer the greatest brunt of this, whether the increasing temperature or the increasing precipitation. And this is really affecting the production of staple crops like maize, beans, millet, groundnuts, which serves as a base for a lot of the meals in the country. And the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology indeed pointed out that 34% of households in the Upper East region alone experience food insecurity compared to other parts of the country, especially comparing to the Greater Accra region, which only 2% of the population. And this food insecurity is as a result of a number of factors. Besides the climate factors, there are also system-specific factors that is affecting access to resources for cultivation and other things. But the climate change is worsening the situation as we have it. Please, we can move to the next slide. So this is what I was speaking about. So we can move to the next one. in the context of this, there's a need to, especially with the effect of climate extreme event, there's a need to adapt production system and then also put in place mitigation arrangement. Indeed, we all agree that global climate change, in terms of increasing precipitation and increasing temperature, is having impact on all. However, the ability to adapt or put in place mitigation factors are affected by context-specific factors, and therefore any solution must be put together considering the contextual factors that affect people's ability to utilize the adaptive options that may be available. And in our context, specifically when in relation to food production and food security, it is access to productive resources, especially land. However, access to some of these resources are mediated by contextual factors. It must be noted that within Ghana, we don't have state control over land. Land is controlled by stools or traditional authorities and families. So, though we have national laws governing the transaction and use of land, these laws are only enforced when it comes to litigation on land and other things. But the government cannot take land and say, this is what I want the land to be used for. It can only acquire land through the traditional authorities. And some of the factors within the traditional custom on land allocation tends to create a lot of inequalities, especially in relation to gender and then residential status, whether you are an indigene or you are a migrant in the place. And this has led to a lot of challenges, especially when it comes to food production, because the literature has clearly highlighted the place of women in the production of food crops, which is very vital to secure food availability access as well. So these factors tend to affect the ability of women to participate, especially in the northern part of Ghana. It is not so worse in other parts of Ghana, the southern part or the central part, because of the different land tenure arrangement and the inheritance system. But in the northern part of Ghana, there is a strict adherence to the patrilineal system, where land can only be acquired through males, so either fathers, brothers, or uncles. Please, shall we move on? So how can we deal with this situation in the context of climate change and then the increasing threat of food insecurity, especially in the northern part of Ghana? One of the clearest ways to deal with this is to look at the issue within the context and then come up with context-specific solutions rather than coming up with a broader one-size-fits-all approach, because a lot of the approaches that have been used in other parts of Africa, like in Ethiopia, in Madagascar, other places where there is a sweeping land titling program and all that, that may not work within the context of Ghana because of the ownership of land and then the land governance structure. So there is a need for context-specific approach to be adopted in dealing with how traditional authorities manage land and how customs and tradition affect who gets access to what kind of land. It's very, very important. And in this way, it is very important for traditional leaders to interface with governmental authorities as well as the people within the context to find the best solutions to land access and land acquisition, because of the collective disadvantage to all when tradition and custom inhibit people's access to land, which may be used for cultivation and then in essence affect food production. Besides dealing with the land-based issues, there's also the need for a proper early warning system to be established through the district assemblies, through the partnership with the donor governmental agencies. And in Ghana, a lot of donors have really contributed, GIZ, Danida, and then I remember I've worked personally with Engineers Without Borders in the communities, trying to help people adapt and all that. So some of these strategies can help. Another way of also dealing with some of these issues, please, next slide. Dealing with some of these issues is to expand land access through block farming arrangements and nucleus farming arrangements. And in this way, more women will be engaged, would have increased access to land, and not just have access, but tenure security, so that they are able to produce more food. Because we realize that most of the time, the men use their land to produce cash crop, which are normally not consumed on a daily, so cocoa, coffee, cashew, and sometimes oil palm. But more women who have land tend to use it in the production of food crops, which will guarantee food security. And then also, there's also the greater need to invest in the climate smart agricultural medium. So ecosystem-based management practices like land rotation. Then also the need to also go into low carbon technologies to power equipment, irrigation equipment, and then organic farming generally. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And again, my great appreciation to everyone for being so disciplined on the time. We have a little over 20, 25 minutes left that we can engage in the Q&A at the moment. And before I get into that, I just want to give the reminder, not only to the audience online that you can post your questions, but to the panelists that where you see questions that you've got a burning answer for, feel free to provide that by text in the Q&A. Given the flow we've had so far, I'd actually like to go to each of our speakers quickly. And first, Sophia, you've been listening now to Darrin, Sandra, and Nee. Maybe I can challenge you. What is one thing that scares you and one thing that gives you hope from what you've heard about the context for farmers in Canada, in Africa, and Ghana?
Well, I think the science is very frightening, and Darrin underscored it. The IPCC report, it's not easy reading, and it's so. I think that's perhaps the most frightening thing. That and we don't know. We know we've unleashed something that is not predictable. And I think that's one of the important insights for me out of systems thinking and systems learning, is that you actually expect not to know. And I think this last 100 years of really high-put agriculture is also dominated by a kind of scientific thinking where we have the answers. And we didn't historically as a species, and I don't think we do now have the answers, which is where I think a lot of the false solutions lie in so that's frightening. What is encouraging, as Darrin put, agriculture for 99% of our history has been zero emitting. So when we see net zero, we are, I think, a little bit taken astray from where we need to go. And I think that the other thing that I take is how different this will be. It was really fascinating to listen to how land tenure laws are going to affect what you do on climate change. And that's what I was wanting to say about, I said it about biodiversity. I think it's also true about our culture and about our laws. They need to be adaptive. They need to understand what we're trying to do. And you need to put in place an adaptive process that will be a learning one. And I think that's what we heard from Nee and from Sandra, is how you look at the continent, then you go to a country, then you go and look at how it will perhaps specifically deal with this. And then we'll have different opportunities based on its history and based on its knowledge.
Great, Darrin. I'm going to put you on the spot in 3 ways. First is if there's any reactions to what you heard from Sophia, Sandra, and me, anything that immediately seemed like, oh, here's a follow-up comment or question you'd like to pose to them. And then I'm going to encourage you to respond to the 2 questions we have in the chat. So the first from Irvin, who is really asking that essential question of where to from here. How do we get all of this into the heads of politicians at the federal and provincial levels in time? And then from John Stone, the challenge that it seemed you were arguing that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions come from inputs, but livestock. And maybe you could just speak to the production of gases from livestock. So any reactions, questions on engaging politicians, and then livestock as source of emission. So over to you, sir.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for the questions, and I'll try and keep my answers very brief. Happy for follow-up questions if there are any. The thing that came to mind when I was listening to Nee and Sandra and Sophia is something around adaptation that I think has been said, but maybe subtly or implied, and needs to be really foregrounded and underlined, and that is there's a tremendous justice issue here. That even if Canadian farmers and food systems or the global north, even if we can adapt, our emissions are having devastating effects in a lot of places that don't have the kind of billions of dollars that we have in order to adapt. So when we adapt to climate change, and climate change largely driven by rich country emissions, we're lessening the impact of those emissions on us. But we continue to produce those emissions, and they're having massive impacts on places where the infrastructure and financial capacity to adapt doesn't match ours. So we need to adapt, but at the same time, we need to be very cognizant of the justice issues and just the moral and ethical place we are when we do that. In terms of the questions that were raised, how do we get this higher up on the priority list amongst politicians? It's a good news, bad news situation. One, emission reduction and climate resilience in Canada has moved up very dramatically on the priority list. I think it has in America too. In Canada, we've got a bunch of new programs recently, a bunch of new funding recently, thanks to Farmers for Climate Solutions and others that have really put this on the radar. In the US, very strong commitment at the USDA and from the Biden government. Very, very progressive things coming out of the EU and elsewhere. What Nee and Sandra said, a lot happening in Africa too. So that's the positive. The negative is this is all happening in a very confused and confounded policy space, where in Canada, for instance, even though we're doing things on climate change, the prime directive is maximize exports and maximize production, and that's going to give you a maximum emission food system. So we need to back away from that emission increasing goal and more fully commit to those emission reducing goals. The third and last question is around livestock, and that's an incisive point. And I was aware, when I was making that sort of sweeping statement that agriculture doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions, that we count a lot of emissions from livestock. But I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's really like peeling an onion. I'm in year 10 of grappling with what role livestock have in a sustainable global food supply. And just to make one or two quick points, North America was covered in grassland and bison, and there was tens of millions of those bison, and they emitted methane. And now we have tens of millions of cows, and they emit methane. And the numbers aren't exactly the same. The systems aren't the same. There's a lot to be said about that. But in no way should anyone imagine that a future climate compatible agriculture is one without livestock. We need livestock, we need grasslands, they co-evolve together. We need that biodiversity. It would just be horrible to see a countryside devoid of animals. That in no way is sustainable or natural. So we need to find ways to retain livestock and the benefits at the same time mitigating and reducing their emissions. But the point is a good one. Livestock are currently counted as a large emission source. So thank you.
Great, very concise and useful answers. Thank you, Darrin. And just one thing I think both of you have touched on is the interdependence of Canada and the world in these cases. When we start picking up what are the value chains of agricultural trade, it's very quickly that there are things that Canada consumes it doesn't own. So, Sophia, what you had brought out, and whether it's the morning coffee or the chocolate treat, those aren't necessarily things that we can source easily within our borders, independent of whatever we may or may not be able to do on the prairies. Also, you've pointed to the need for basically whole-scale transformation of how our societies organize themselves. And that's not just how do we manage billions, whether in agricultural support domestically or what we've called official development assistance up until now, but this is about the trillions that all of our societies invest in themselves and their future. And if we hear whether it's Mary Robertson or Mark Carney speak about making all financial flows Paris compatible. So not just thinking about that resource set aside to say, oh, well, that's climate finance. If we think actually this is what everybody needs to be thinking about, including our portfolios as pensioners or what have you, that opens our eyes to something quite substantial. So both if net zero is our food chains across the world, not just the farm in Saskatchewan, and if all of our finance really does live up to the climate crisis, this is going to be a really exciting time to be alive. Maybe I can just turn to Nia and Sandra if you're around. Same invitation. Yes. If you have any reactions to the other presentations. And then I'm just going to briefly read the two questions I've been pointed out to you specifically. So we have from Sierra, thank you for your presentation. She did a good job on covering the complexity of the issues. Could you tell us about how climate change and culture, land titling and gendering, is linked with agricultural accumulation, the way input-intensive farming is intensifying the effects of climate change for smallholders. And I think you've already answered the question from Roy, who's really challenging us about in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the developing world, women's right to own and access land is typically weak. How are some countries enacting legislation to guarantee women's right to land as major consumers? So, Nii, over to you, those reactions. Any thoughts on those two questions that you'd like to share with the group?
Okay, so my first thoughts on the issue of climate change and culture and how it is affecting titling. Like I said earlier, context really matters. And in Ghana, the issue of titling as a solution has been spoken about before, but the challenge really is that the extent to which government controls land affects issues of titling. So it's more about traditional and family ownership. And even in the context where the land has been given to a person as a piece of land to cultivate on, once the land is left idle for a short period of time, it can be taken over by others. So that is one issue of concern of tenure security, issues of management and control of the land itself. Currently, Ghana has revised the Land Act. So now we have a new Land Act, but it tends to center more on land for estate purposes and not agricultural purposes. And that's where the issue we've had. I know a country like Ethiopia embarked on a very massive titling land titling procedure in order to secure access to land for women. However, the situations tend to be country specific, and the results obtained or the how effective those policies are affected largely by context factors. So I cannot say that it can work like that in terms of a sweeping policy in terms of titling and then ownership as well. And then the second part of that question in relation to the use of inputs and other things, and then coming in with donor-funded programs like the Planting for Food and Jobs, which is funded by the Canadian government. I think in as much as we try to echo nature-based solution, most of these programs rather tend to emphasize conventional agricultural methods. So use of hybrid seeds. And sometimes the challenge is that they come to push away the local seeds, which tends to rather survive in the climate extreme situation. So we are saying that it is important to emphasize rather low input agriculture and see the effect, because there is evidence to show that low input agriculture indeed produces results if it is done well. But the quick fix approach of donor funders of using input because we want to solve a problem rather tends to affect, because as we speak now, most parts of the northern region have issues of high level of alkaline in the soil. So you are having the adverse effect of the use of intensive use of inputs just to push up production.
Great. So in the interest of time and to make it such a lively debate, I'm going to grab a couple of things I'm seeing from the Q&A. First is what Nia has just spoken to. Is there a tension between low input agriculture and the need to feed the world? You know, if we go this route for a low input agriculture, is it going to actually result in less production, less people being fed, more hunger? Is that a trade-off to be considered? So that's one question that's coming out. Secondly is and these are open to anyone, the difference between agroecology and climate smart agriculture. Does someone want to make a stab at what the meaningful difference is between those terms, or are they actually just used synonymously in some circles? And then a provocation from Bruce Campbell about Cuba as an exemplar. Is Cuba, in a sense, some place to really look at and learn from, given how it's had to do with less inputs of at least hydrocarbons for a couple of decades now? So I can imagine, Darrin, you want to jump in on this. Sandra, I know you're back, and Sophia, you probably have some views as well. So I'm just going to let it be sort of open mic for a bit on those points about low input agriculture versus feeding the world, difference between agroecology and climate smart ag, and is Cuba an exemplar?
Sandra, you haven't had a chance yet to come in again. Would you like a chance at those questions?
Yes, I think with the agro, or let's say the ecosystem-based farming practices or the agroecology, can be used interchangeably with that of the climate smart, because it both of them aim at reducing the vulnerability of the community, and as well as improving or increasing the resilience in terms of climate change and climate variability. However, in as much as they all aim at increasing productivity, it also reduce cost of production. And this, in a way, maintain the ecosystem. For instance, the use of mulching, crop rotation, and heightening of which in Africa, where we have less than or 5% of our cultivated area under or being irrigated. So this system of farm practices would improve or would in a way maintain our ecosystem. So I think using the agroecology in terms of farming practices would help in this direction, and as well as also improve and increase agricultural productivity, not necessarily reducing the production.
If I come in on that, I would agree. I think One thing I think we would say at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, for us in the circles we are in, we resist climate smart as a term and prefer agroecology because we see agroecology, we look at these 13 principles that have been outlined and for us, the voice of the community is really important and is something that is sort of integrated into the way agroecology has been developed in a way, and that climate smart often for us in the policy discussions we have becomes a shorthand for a single fix, and a fix that is focused on a technique or a technology. So it's a vital part, but it doesn't necessarily then integrate with all the other things that are going on and the other challenges the communities might face. So that for us would be a distinction. It's not that there's something wrong about climate smart, but more in how do you see change happen? What do you think development does? And I think the whole thing about low input agriculture and hunger, there's so many myths to unpack. It's a real and important question. Yield matters. For much of human history, agriculture was maybe low emission. There was also a lot of hunger. So it's not to make light of that, but to understand that we have created hunger with abundance. We have undermined food systems in many parts of the world by industrializing the food production of certain places and then creating patterns of trade based on a colonial relationship as opposed to a respectful relationship. So it isn't unimportant, and there's really good research. And I think the best research is looking at a mix of things. What happens to household income? What happens to household health? What happens to nutrition? What happens to the land? What happens to productivity over time? What happens to your markets? And looking at it together, the vast majority of food that people eat today is grown in relatively low output systems, and we can continue to do that. And if we stopped quite a lot of the industrial production that we have, we would be helping food production and food security elsewhere. So I don't want to say it's simple, but I think there's a lot to be done before we start to say, oh no, we're putting food security at risk by reducing emissions from an industrial system in North America.
I
totally agree with you, Sophia. I've always had this impression that the issue of food security sometimes is actually the food systems that have been disrupted, as well as the distribution of food, so that so much is produced, but distributing it rightly is the issue. So sometimes if we get our systems right, and then we get the mechanism right, and then the global political network of food systems and food distribution, if we get it right, some of these challenges would be addressed, even using less of carbon-based fertilizers that tends to emit more and then contribute to global, so that maybe not necessarily moving entirely away from these systems, but combining it with agroecology and in a sustainable way would help.
Yeah, if I can just add to the question around low input and feeding the world, I always smile when feeding the world is brought out. But when you think about what we do with our food, we produce huge amounts with massive fossil fuel inputs and massive emissions, and then we waste huge amounts, about 40% in Canada. We turn a bunch more into some very unwise biofuels. We're literally so overproducing corn and some other crops that we have to sort of feed them into the fuel supply and burn them. We take a bunch more food and create nutritionally disfigured foods like sugar pops and Cheetos and soft drinks that aren't doing people much good. And then we take another portion of the food supply and we relatively inefficiently turn it into livestock products. Some of you may know that it takes about 10 calories of grain to produce 1 calorie of beef, or X number of units of protein to produce 1 unit of meat protein. So there's a huge inefficiency, very high output, but then a lot of that output is dissipated into a lot of things that are not actually food and nutrition and health.
Great. I don't know where to go from here. I mean, this is such a rich sampler plate of views, but maybe I can just challenge Darrin, Sandra, and Nee to same that we asked Sophia. What inspires you? What gives you hope on adaptation of food systems and agriculture now and in the coming years? So start with you, Darrin, since you're on the mic as it is.
Two things. One, just how many solutions are there? Just how much potential there is to wring emissions out of the system and to rebuild soils and rebuild climate resiliency. And two, just how much attention this has got. A couple of years ago, the landscape was vastly different, whether it was in a national capital or in forums such as we're talking about now. There's just been sort of a very dramatic increase in the attention to this and the prioritization of this.
Great. Sandra and then Nee, what gives you hope?
I think for me personally, I've always maintained that so long as things continue to change, humans will find a way to adapt. We are that resilient. And I feel that in as much as the issue is very complex and it keeps changing as the years go on, people would always come to a solution where people now begin to understand that this threat is real and we have to take a solution that will help everybody. So I really feel that we will build resilience over time, just that to take some convincing.
Great.
Yes, and I think we have to be proactive in whatever we are doing. Moving away from this conventional system of farming into the ecosystem-based farm management practices would help, one, to reduce vulnerability and also increase our level of resilience in terms of climate change impact and variability. Because most studies have shown that some form of modern practices in farming, used in farming, pose environmental threats and also in terms of sustainable production of food has pose a threat to sustainable food production. Therefore, moving away from conventional farming practices to this more ecological, ecosystem-based farming practice will help. So it takes time, and it's also, let me say, it's somehow primitive. But if we are able to adapt with being proactive, I think we will get there.
Fantastic. I really liked how all of you were able to not only do that cascade from global to the Canadian to a local context, also where certain parts of the world fit into this, but really tie together the adaptation challenge and how addressing adaptation is intimately linked to getting real with a net zero reality. And that there is this very clear agenda that the Group of 78 continues to push on and needs to push on delivering on these commitments. What does it really mean to be adapting and resilient to climate change? What does it mean here at home? What does it mean for our role in the world? And we cannot miss these commitments. The ambition to get 45% below where we've been by 2030, to get towards net zero by 2050. And 2050 is tomorrow. This is within the lifespan of a mortgage. This is within the lifespan of anyone that's thinking seriously about business plans and infrastructure into the future. So what we do now matters. Great job title, Darrin, about being part of the climate crisis, because we're in that. Let me just also point to what scares me, these limits. Even though we know some ways of adapting, some of them may be literally burned out in certain parts of the world, and our food systems need not just to adapt, but also transform. And is that scale of transformation even possible? How will the next couple of decades roll out? It'll be really interesting to see what your sequel book will be in 20 years from now. Let me just finalize by thanking everyone, Sophia, Darrin, Sandra, and me, for your preparations, your time, sharing your thoughts with us, engaging each other and the audience. My thanks to the audience for being able to be as engaged as you were, putting forward your questions. We tried to reach all of them. We were probably variable in our success, but it shows the interest in this topic. I also want to thank Sarah for the fantastic technical support in the background of making Zoom work well, not always an easy thing. And maybe the last word to Susan and Roy on what else to look forward to in this conference. And any final word you would like to share, come on in. And thank you, everyone.
Well, in terms of thanking Bruce, I really admire your brilliant moderating, providing the context for each of the speeches and the interconnections of each of them. And so that I really thank you very much for your preparation and time and presentation. Fabulous. And in terms of going on to another set of wonderful presentations. Tomorrow, we have Tuesday, September 28th, we have the panel on health adaptation. And we heard quite a bit about health today. And there certainly is a link between today's talk and tomorrow's. And there's another brilliant panel moderated by Christopher Hughes, Professor of International Development and Global Studies at University of Ottawa. And brilliant speakers as well. And then Wednesday, the 29th at noon, will be Bob Ray, who is our ambassador to the United Nations. And the reason he is on Wednesday is that he had to talk for Canada at the UN on Saturday when he was supposed to speak to us. And right after him, there is two municipal councillors from Nanaimo who are talking about the urban local adaptation plan and how they arrived to theirs through donut economics. And I challenge you to look up donut economics before Wednesday because it's really a fabulous theory. And it links to Bob Ray's presentation in that the Sustainable Development Goals agreed to by the members of the United Nations are the center of the donut. What my son calls the Timbit of the donut is the very special social development goals. So please do stay with us. And then finally, we're back to financial institutions on the Thursday, which we started with a week ago almost a week ago on Thursday with Adjei Ghosh. And so please, we've got both a keynote and a panel on our last day of presentations, September 30th. And I hope to see you all then. Thank you very much.